I think we have a societal issue with sincerity. Earnestness and sincerity are difficult for people. The notion of being earnestly devoted to something is difficult to engage with for a lot of people. There's such a hesitancy to lean in and love something with a kind of reckless teenage enjoyment that young women are particularly derided for. A genre that celebrates exactly that set of emotions and then orchestrates circumstances to produce them, not just in the reader, but in their characters. I see how people look at it and then decide it's not worth delving further into, because I think emotions make people uncomfortable to think about love with any seriousness.
Hello, and welcome back to Care So Much. I am so excited about today's guest. Her name is Sanjana Basker, and she is a book talker. Her bio, which I think speaks for itself, is books mostly. So we're going to be talking today about romance books specifically. Sanjana is one of my favorite book talkers. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it right over to you, Sanjana.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. I was just telling Lillian I love to talk, and I hope that I'm relatively decent at it. And I really, really love to talk about romance. I read a lot of romance. I review romance now on Book Talk. But outside of that, I'm a grad student in psychology. My research specialization is actually in sexuality, gender, intimacy, women's health. So I'm starting to find more and more parallels between my academic work and my book stuff, which I think makes sense because I get called very academic on Book Talk too. So that's basically what I do. I read a lot. I talk about reading a lot. I read a lot for school, and then I talk about reading in school. So really, I'm a woman of few specializations.
Well, that's ideal. The more you know about the one thing, the more you can speak to it with authority. I completely agree that the way you talk about romance books is fairly unique for romance readers and influencers because you do speak about it so academic. But I want to start up top with something that I think both you and I enjoy about romance, which is it is for fun. It's for joy. It's because we like doing it. And that in and of itself is enough value.
Here's the thing. And I don't want to overcomplicate this idea because you're right. That's important in and of itself. Romance is fun. It is joyful. It is a genre that is meant to celebrate joy. It's meant to celebrate community and partnership and all of these things. And it's meant to be celebratory and joyful. And it is also, I think, a political act to engage in a medium that is meant to be restorative like this. I think a lot of the attitude that people culturally have to reading is really productivity oriented, right? There's a lot of discourse about reading self-help or reading nonfiction specifically with the aim of optimizing your selfhood. Something I became really aware of the more I read romance and the more that I kept getting told that it was frivolous and a waste of my time, the more I realized that people wanted me to be spending my time on things that were profit oriented. And that is what's so frustrating about something that is so unabashedly dedicated to joy and leisure and enjoyment is I can't necessarily draw a one-to-one line between romance and a lesson learned, though of course the more you read the more you realize that is complicated in and of itself. That is the thing that I needed most. Romance is a thing that for a lot of people really reemerged during the pandemic as the way that we continued to feel like real people. And that is important.
Reading is supposed to be value. You're supposed to be doing it to grow as a person, and particularly that productivity idea. That was my attitude about reading for a while there. I basically got really busy in high school. I had a million after school activities and I was doing a really intense academic workload. And so I stopped having time to read for anything other than school. And then when I got into college, I kept up the same attitude. And then when I graduated, I was in the same space of well, if you're going to spend your time reading, you should read one of these books that is for value. And so it was things like biographies or certainly nonfiction. And it was during the pandemic that I took a moment and went, I used to just love reading.
Yeah.
Why is it okay for me to spend hours scrolling through social media or hours sitting on my couch binging a TV show I've seen 10 times, but I can't read a book that has kissing in it because it's fun?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like these questions about leisure don't really present themselves when you talk about other mediums, but for some reason, and I guess the reason is like traditional schooling, like the associations between reading, productivity, and optimization are like really hard to challenge because we've had 12 years or more, like 16 years of education that tells us that you open a book in order to yank something out of it instead of to return yourself to it, you know, like, and I think a lot of people went through a similar arc of like reading for enjoyment until they hit right about high school. Like they finished a lot of those young adult stories that they really loved, went through a high school lull, and didn't really return until after college.
Is that a similar experience for you?
I basically like did not read for enjoyment until my senior year of college. I had like a really light course load. I sort of sat down and was like, I have a year. I'll read 52 books in 52 weeks. And then I did. Over the course of that year, what I didn't end up documenting is in the background, I was also reading hundreds of romance novels. So on top of the 52 predominantly not like a mixture of like literary fiction, contemporary fiction, some nonfic, I was reading hundreds of romance novels to the point where it was like, I'm not even shy about the fact that I was reading romance. It was the sheer volume I was reading that felt like I couldn't disclose that without seeming pathological. And so and it was also the most I had read again since middle school, right? Like I hadn't experienced that kind of enjoyment since I put Percy Jackson down.
I think it was Hunger Games was the last books that had like really consumed me like that. And you talk about this a lot. Why does romance in particular fall outside of this other kind of reading? I think even when I was reading mostly nonfiction books, and every once in a while I would pick up like an epic fantasy or something and feel good about that still. But there was something about romance that felt too frivolous. Something that I actually, the first time that I understood why romance felt different and how it connected to other constructs was you explaining it on TikTok.
I'm interested to hear which explanation you found most compelling. I think it's multifaceted, of course. Like, I want to talk about the gendered nature of this. Like, there is a gender asymmetry here. And I'm trying to find better language to talk about this, right? Because I don't want to say that, like, men are not involved in the making, reading, consumption of romance. I don't think that's fair to especially queer men who have been part of the backbone of romance as a genre. And I don't think it's fair to be exclusionary of non-binary folks who, like some of my favorite romance critics and reviewers are non-binary, and we're like seeing a resurgence of queer representation in the genre. So that's my like preface to say I'm trying to be responsible about how I talk about the gender asymmetry. Of course, so much of the reputation around romance is that it is frivolous women's enjoyment. It's the same sort of derision that like rom-coms get for being funny and charming, but like not serious enough to merit Oscar consideration, not serious acting, the cash cow that actors have on their way to Oscar-winning roles. It's this wildly profitable, wildly popular genre that like is the stuffing in a pillow instead of the substance, right? Like I'm trying to find better ways to articulate that. I think that's part of the reason for the perceived frivolity. I think gender plays a huge role in it, and sort of misogyny and sexism plays a huge role in it. And I also think that part of it is just like, I think we have a societal issue with sincerity. I think earnestness and sincerity are difficult for people. And I think that's part of why I was so like intrigued by the premise of like Care So Much. The notion of being like earnestly devoted to something, I think is really difficult to engage with for a lot of people, especially academics or self-described intellectuals. There's such a hesitancy to lean in and love something with like a kind of reckless teenage enjoyment that young women are particularly derided for. A genre that celebrates exactly that like kind of feverish, dramatic, intense set of emotions, orchestrate circumstances to produce them, not just in the reader, but in their characters. I think I see how people look at it and then decide it's not worth delving further into, because I think emotions make people antsy. Like, I think it makes them uncomfortable to think about like love with any seriousness. And I talked about a bell hooks essay on my TikTok a while ago that I particularly like about this topic called Love as a Practice of Freedom. And I like reread that essay a few times a year probably. And in it, she's talking about like specifically Black feminist thought and politics and her beliefs around why if you don't center love in your activism and work, you end up replicating similar systems of power that you seek to liberate yourself from. It was one of those things where she acknowledges upfront that like a lot of like activists and advocates are hesitant to talk about subjects like love with any seriousness. Like it is too sentimental, it is like too earnest to be worth consideration, and yet it is like the most essential thing. Like it has to be the core of your politics, or you will burn out, you will run out of steam, you'll replicate systems of power. And so like when you have an entire genre that is devoted to the unpacking of love, the space for that derision exists again, for misogyny reasons and also for that.
I think you did a great job of adding in that caveat of we want to be careful about saying women specifically. I think the idea of the perception is certainly that romance is for frivolous women. Therefore, if you consider yourself a serious woman, if you want to be a real good feminist, you can't enjoy it, which we're definitely going to unpack that one.
Oh, yeah.
But also the idea that even men or non-binary people who have interest in this genre or want to talk about this genre, they're associating themselves with frivolous femininity as opposed to things that are strong and good, like masculine areas.
Right. Self-help books.
For sure. When I read something like Lean In, which I did read, and I know there's lots of problematic things there, that was so that I could be a better capitalist, as opposed to when I read the Bridgerton books, it's because I thought they would be fun and I was right. But I'm now going to quote You to You, which makes people uncomfortable and I sort of love it. But I'm pretty sure this was from either the video that you were talking about, that essay, or right around the same time. You said, if I was not angry and jaded and depressed all the time, then I wasn't paying attention. So how do you think that romance and finding the joy in enjoying romance subverts that idea that you have to be this like really intense person to be intelligent?
Oh boy. One of my favorite books is Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. It's a nonfiction collection of essays on the relationship that she has to a number of delusions that present itself in late stage capitalism. She has an essay about bar classes, and she has an essay about the institution of marriage and all sorts of other things, fixtures of 21st century life that like she is complicit in and also like can't sort of extricate herself from, that she recognizes are problematic. I mention this because she is like one of my favorite thinkers, and she had an interview promoting this book. Ezra Klein, maybe, I think she was talking to. And in it, she was talking about her like role as a writer on the internet and a cultural critic and someone who is, you know, writing all these essays about very present, current moment things, and how like, especially early in her career, the expectation was that she was always on Twitter. She had to always be online. She always had to be present and knowledgeable. And if you didn't know something that was happening, if you weren't the first person on the scene, if you weren't writing about it, reacting to it, experiencing an emotion and talking about it immediately, saying, isn't this a terrible tragedy? Isn't this expressing the outrage, farming the outrage, articulating all of the negative emotions that accompany like being aware of the news as like a living person in this day and age? She wasn't doing her job. That is the criticism that she would have received if she had not been what we would just say is like chronically online. Right. And of course, she's a journalist. So her role is probably much more intense than the rest of us. But like still, both of them were sort of commiserating in this interview about how like there was an expectation, constant anger, sadness, and rage. And she talked specifically about a case of a multimillionaire who, after he sort of quit his job, bought up like huge swaths of wetland, like endangered wetland in like Indiana. Or...
We can put links to all of these articles and things in the description, and people can just duck down and check on that.
Excellent. Bought up this endangered wetland and went off the grid. And he devoted his money and his time to restoring this wetland. There was so much outrage around this Twitter spell of like, I can't believe like the amount of privilege it takes to be offline, fully extricate yourself from public news. Like the rest of us can't afford to do that. And she was sort of like, yeah, but what have you done? Like, what have you done by sitting here with your Twitter fingers and like talking about this whole story that I'm telling of like this multimillionaire who has leveraged his privilege to like restore natural land. And like, of course, we can talk about the complicated political choice that might, who has like taken a tangible living step towards improving a physical environment that is necessary for the world. how that comes across as irresponsible to people who like see rage as a requirement in their politics and in their lives. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about romance reading and about the intellectual obsession with being jaded and cynical. At that point, I had hit about 3 years of romance reading really regularly, probably well over like 1,000 books at that point of romance novels. And I was repairing my sense of like hope in people through it. I just kept seeing people who like were writing stories about people who cared about each other a lot, and not just love interest to love interest, but also like side characters, families, the proximal building of community, which in most romance novels is also a critical part of the narrative. And I was like, I don't care about being the most immediately informed. I care about being informed. I care about being present in this culture. And I do not have a multimillionaire's privilege. But there's something more pressing for me than feeding this cynicism. There's something more pressing for me in my like personal ethic and politics than being upset. I need to find ways to restore joy, because, and this is also actually something that comes up a lot in like climate activism discourse of like climate doomerism, of like the tendency to say like nothing is possible, everything is bad.
I'm so sorry. Is there an ice cream truck in the background happening right now?
Yeah.
That's spectacular. I should move to New York just so that when I record podcasts, I catch a little ice cream truck music.
I'm glad it moved kind of fast, because usually it just like hovers on this corner for ages. And it is really sweet and like kind of idyllic until it hits like minute 7 or 8. And then you want to go out there and like have some words with the ice cream truck man.
I feel like I did just a classic. I live in the Midwest and you live in New York, and I made, because New York City is so romantic. Like it's so wonderful. Like you've got these like fun, like the city's so alive, and you're sitting there being like, no, it's great. Ice cream trucks are great until you listen to it for 2 hours. Amazing. Spectacular. Well, let's talk about climate change really quick.
Climate doomerism, right? The idea that this is an unsolvable, unfixable problem, sort of being sad about things. Frontline activists in climate change work are like, no, you actually have to build rituals of joy, because otherwise you cannot persist in this work. And also the idea that this is an unfixable problem is ahistorical and inaccurate. But unless you take a step back from those issues enough to like recultivate an ethic of joy, really cannot actually do the work. And so when I think about this whole thing of romance being a thing that restores a sense of joy in me, I really think of it as being profoundly political and a necessary personal decision that I made. Center romance in my life and romance reading in my reading life. Because our world is bleak. We are deserving of joy, and that joy allows us to make the world better.
As somebody who's really struggled with mental health issues, I can say personally, if in order to be a good person, you have to be anxious and depressed, you are going to be anxious and depressed. So letting go of that idea and being okay with finding joy and being able to hold the two ideas simultaneously in your head, that there is difficult, bad things that happen that matter and you should care about. And also books with kissing are good. Like being able to hold both of those in my head at the same time, that I can spend my time and energy being a knowledgeable person who cares about things and who really likes to read books about big blue aliens. Those are acceptable things that can both be true of me.
I am in full support. Full support. And that's the thing, right? Like we contain multitudes. Like we can actually read about blue aliens, and we can also read about like the complicated reproductive rights after Roe v. Wade is overturned. Like those things exist all in one person, in many people, right? Yeah. This is sort of a side note. And this is not a thing that I think needs to be true in order to lend credentials to romance as a genre. But the number of romance authors I know who are like former academics, who are teachers, who are former Supreme Court justice clerks, who are veterinarians, physicians, they lead complicated intellectual, academic, personal, professional lives that are reflected in their work, right? Like even these authors contain multitudes in this genre, which isn't to say that I think someone needs all the academic credentials in order for their work to be worthwhile. That is also the case in this genre.
We've talked a lot about the morality of romance and all of these other things and why it's okay to love it. And there are some people who are probably listening that have a generic idea of what romance is, But what are some of the things that are like defining of the genre?
Often I'm explaining like what a genre is to people, because there's sort of a sense of like, why are there rules around what is and isn't a romance? And I'm like, well, if you pick up a murder mystery and no one dies and no mystery is solved, you'd probably be a little pissed, to be honest. Like, you'd probably be upset. It's the whole notion of the promise of the premise, which comes up a lot in a podcast I like called Fated Mates, which talks about romance. But it's basically the notion of like, there's a contract between an author and a reader that when you pick up their book, you are granted a certain kind of material. It depends on what genre you're reading, what that contract is. But in romance, the contract is that like the love story is the center of the narrative between two or more people, and the end must be a happily ever after. You can have no doubt in your mind that these two people or more end up together and that they will be happy for the rest of their lives. And also, sort of in some distant theoretical lens, you aren't really supposed to believe in like the death of these characters either. And maybe we can unpack that at some point. But like the idea is that they live on eternal happily. The two main criteria is like love and that love forever.
I also find myself explaining to people a lot is the validity of that idea of happily ever after, the validity of the guaranteed happy ending. Because I was talking to one of my brothers who is a big fantasy reader, and he's not trying to dissuade me from reading romance, but I'm like, it feels so similar to me if you're reading like the Lord of the Rings type epic fantasy and there's an evil person. If that embodiment of evil wins, that would be disappointing. And knowing that the evil person is going to win at the end of the story doesn't make the path to get there less interesting or less compelling. It's about what it costs. It's about how these characters grow. It's about how they're different throughout the story. That to me is the same as the guaranteed happy ending. And like you said, it's that contract I have with the author of like, listen, I'm going to go with you on that third act breakup because you promised me they get together at the end.
It's 100% that. Like, it's no different than the like abolishment of evil at the end of the fantasy. It is no different than the solving of the mystery. It is no different than the root of the thriller being exposed. It is all the same. Like, all genre fiction is essentially a contract.
You're so good.
Sorry.
We're getting the ambience of New York. She's really proving that she's in New York. That's actually not even what's happening around, like the crashes and the ice cream truck. That is just audio she's playing in the background to try to convince us that she lives there.
Yeah. Any second now, you might hear bottles being thrown, and that's just a part of this sample that I'm playing on speaker in my room. But yes, this is just the nature of a genre, right? Like, it's the most basic English language arts thing. And people just take issue with this specific contract. To that, I say, find another genre.
It's not for you, and that's fine.
It's that easy.
You don't have to love romance. I love romance. I don't like true crime. It makes me cry and sad.
Yeah.
It feels, because it literally is real, it feels too real for me, and I get actually upset. That does not mean that you liking true crime is a bad thing. That does not mean that you're a bad person who wants murders to happen.
Right.
Sometimes you do, though, and that is a problem, guys.
Right. In which case, seek help.
That's what therapy is for.
Exactly.
But one of the other things within romance that, again, is true of other genres, particularly as I started reading more romance, because there is this element of most romance readers I know do what you do, which is consume just massive amounts of romance, which I also do. Often you're trying to find more books that make you feel that way, right? Like you're trying to capture that. So romance, more than other genres, in my opinion, leans on tropes and retelling of the same stories.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about the notion of repetition, but I'll start with the thing on tropes. Tropes are just recurring features in a story that have acquired names and become really popular in literature. A really common trope in romance is the only one bed trope, for example. In lots and lots of romance novels over time in history, we have come across a situation where like two potential lovers find themselves at an inn, at a hotel, at a wherever, And lo and behold, there is only one bed. And the whole point of that device is to like create a sense of proximity and physical intimacy with two people who are probably on guard. And because every time it's an exposing of intimacy under these confines, it is a really popular thing to see. It's a recurring trait that you see in a million different contexts, and in many of those contexts, it serves that same purpose. What people find frustrating about tropes, I think, is first of all, an idea that like repetition means the absence of novelty, the idea that like because something is common, it can't be told in a new way. And I think romance as a genre is an answer to that idea that like you can tell a story 1,000 times. And that story is the story in which two people or more fall in love and have it be interesting every single time. It's a thought experiment, right? Like it's like a creative invitation for a writer to look at other elements when there's constancy. Some academics who study like fan fiction call sameness with difference. It's the idea of like all of these structures, the tropes, the frame, the ending, and you have a sense of what the beginning looks like, and what you're really there for is everything in between. The persuasive case made for the ending to be useful, like the happily ever after to be convincing every time. And these tropes are so familiar. Like you have all of these familiar elements in a romance novel, and you are reading one after another, after another, after another. Why is it valuable to read this repetition so much? Why is it valuable to write repetition so much? Because even with all of this repetition, there is something new. And it's only with all of this sameness that you're able to see the differences with sharpness and clarity. And that, I think, makes romance a genre that is really, really reliant on unique authorial voices. Like, I can't remember, maybe this was also on Fated Mates. They were saying some editors will know which one of their writers they're reading within a page. They don't need to see who wrote the book. Like if they've read a page, they know that it's Ali Hazelwood. They know that it's Emily Henry. They know that it's Sarah MacLean. They know that it's Beverly Jenkins. Like that's what I find particularly compelling is like when you see all of these repeated structures is the ability to really dive deep on these tiny technical details that distinguish one narrative from another. You're allowed to be a lot more attentive because the work of distinguishing major structural things in a romance novel is not really there. Or it is, but it depends on like what you're reading. But that's my perspective on why repetition is valuable, at least.
A couple of examples that jump to mind for me, that two series that I've read that have within themselves a lot of repetition, even within the same author and the same series. One that became very popular and I thought I was going to read as a joke and then loved for real was Ice Planet Barbarians.
Oh, I haven't read it, actually. I need to. I'm on kind of a monster romance kick right now, so maybe I'll add it to my queue.
It's one of those books where like it is everything you think it is. You already know what it is. You know the story. You could write the book. Like, you know what this is. The first one has a moment, like the first couple of chapters of the first book, even Ruby Dixon has said, like, I was writing a different story for the first chapters of the first few books because it's these women being kidnapped by aliens and it's a little dark for a hot second there. And then it gets like just cozy romance the rest of the 47 books that I read. I read 47 books in like 2 months.
Oh, it's like literally 47.
Literally 47.
Wow, I thought you were exaggerating.
It starts with, because I've read both the Ice Planet Barbarian stories and the Ice Home stories, and those are totally different.
Oh, right. No, you're so right. That's my fault. My B.
Yeah, that's really embarrassing for you specifically. It's not embarrassing for me. Correct. It's for you.
I should be well versed. This is romance lore at this point.
Another one that I know is particularly common, have you read the Bridgerton books?
I have indeed.
Okay, so I read those after watching the second season of Bridgerton. I was in a real sad slump because I watched it too fast. It was too good.
Yeah. Really relatable.
And was like, I'll just read like just one Bridgerton book. And then I went and bought my local bookstore completely out of Julia Quinn books. I like just literally found all of the books and put them on the table. And the woman at the counter who's the owner and recognized me went, romance readers. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm going to be done with these in a week. You should be, she was totally kidding, but like, I'm like, you should be nicer to me because I'm going to spend more money at your store than anybody else in this whole town.
Oh, yeah. We keep the publishing industry afloat. Mm-hmm. Literally. Like, we literally keep the publishing industry afloat.
So I think the Bridgerton series, it's the core series. It's 8 siblings. You know these siblings, and they're going to follow a series of different tropes and fall in love and get married at the end of the book. And
yeah.
I just described 90% of romances. We still get sucked into each of these other books, though.
Bridgerton is really interesting for me as someone who like reads a lot of historical, loves a lot of historical, and finds that Bridgerton is not the most technically interesting, challenging, or unique of historical. Like, I don't think it's the best of historical romance at all. And I don't say that to be like unkind. I obviously have read and really enjoyed those books, and the show is excellent, and I like really enjoy talking about Bridgerton. But it's interesting because there's so much more out there, and still like it. I think one of the merits of Bridgerton is that it's able to really easily lay out exactly that frame. These people who are following their path, being rich white people who keep finding other rich white people to love and marry. And it is so compelling every time, because when you're looking at something like a frame that is so familiar, you get to really delve into the idea of a character, this individual person navigating a really well-worn frame of like meet, argue and bicker, a sexual tension unfolds, marriage happens at the end, right? Like when you're looking at the marriage plot, there's such an ability to sort of dive into like what makes this essential quality of each person going through the same old well-traveled path. So I'm partial to the second and the third book, and I also actually really like Francesca's. So I'm talking about Anthony and Kate, Sophie and Benedict, and Francesca and Michael, I believe. It's been a while since I read them. Those three are my favorites. Though I do really like Colin and Penelope too. I mean, I really like Penelope. I feel I'm ambivalent about Colin sometimes. I kind of don't really care about his travel journals. I think that's the issue. I'm sort of like,
yeah.
Penelope's the brains in this equation.
Yeah, he did a lot.
In terms of like why this repetition works, I think you get such a distinct sense of like who Anthony and Kate are, who Sophie and Benedict are. Like the specific way that they are formed as people and their individual stories, and the making of, I find particularly Sophie interesting. Like the making of Sophie, who is in effect supposed to play Cinderella in a retelling of Cinderella, is a really interesting, complicated character for me. And like, because so much of the tropes and the structure and the comfort of knowing that she ends up on stable ground happen, I can really delve into the idea of her as a person who is both really soft and also forced to be really resilient and hardworking in a world that's like not meant to provide her any protections. I find her to be interesting and complicated because I don't have to think super hard about all of the other elements of that plot. I'm interested in what it takes for someone who's only ever looked out for themselves being taken care of by somebody. Like that, I think is interesting. And also like a really essential human question. We're always wondering how it is we can become close to other people. It's not a thing that's really easy to do. Or maybe it is when we're children, but like not when we're older and have all this baggage. And so this person who has been repeatedly abandoned and exploited comes across somebody who like wants her so bad he can't think. It's a weird, it's a complicated dilemma that she comes across, where she like has to trust both her experience and her gut, and also this feeling of, I would like very much to like let the reins go. I don't want to have to work so hard anymore. I don't know. That's also kind of like the thesis of Fleabag, isn't it? Like this person who works really hard at being like a good person and maybe doesn't always succeed, and also is like looking for people to be there for her. Like these are all interesting, complicated stories because I don't have to think so hard about like Sophie's eventual happiness. I'm allowed to like sit in that space of her characterization longer. So that's, I think, one thing that I find useful about repetition in romance.
And I think that story in particular is such a great one to talk about a couple of other things that I really love. One, this fits into the idea of how, as feminists, we read these gooey romance books, which so often have themes that are contrary to the standard, frankly, white idea of what feminism should be. It's so focused on so many things around capitalism, and it's this strong, independent woman. And that's definitely who I always thought I had to be in order to be a good feminist. One of the things specifically that you referenced in there is the idea that you have been, that Sophie specifically, but obviously there's a certain amount of self-insert in moments where you're really recognizing something in a character. Fantasy of that book is somebody who wants you so badly that you can just let go and they will take care of you, and that will be good. that somebody just
Yeah.
taking care of you is good. It felt so contrary to so many of my feminist ideals to be able to do that. I find it really interesting that romance is so often a place where women can just explore that idea.
I like really resonate with that. And I think that's also something around like my personal politics evolving over time was like the realization that like individual success or accomplishments or like individual security will not bring us like liberation. Community care does. And in that acknowledgement, you also have to just allow yourself to be cared for. That is required. You need to build interdependencies with other people. And I think it's a specific feature of like Western white feminism to prioritize like individuals and independence and the success of one over the success of a community as like a feature of their feminist politics. When you commit to something like community care, the idea of learning how to be vulnerable with another person becomes really important. It becomes really salient. It's kind of a necessity, right? And I also think we have a lot of discourse about stuff like self-care, and I think that's important, but community care is essential. Being able to belong to other people is like a core function of being in a society, being in a successful functioning society. And I think we don't necessarily live in a very functional one right now. Acknowledging the amount of vulnerability and how we have to reteach ourselves to allow ourselves to rely on other people to build mutual aid systems and systems of care is, I think it's really important. And it's something I really love about romance is the willingness to let someone fall and know that they will be caught. But I think that's a challenging idea for a lot of people. It's a thing that you have to reteach yourself or relearn. And the idea that dependency is weakness is a very Western one. Like it's a very individualistic and very Western one that I think we have to unlearn, not just for this like larger political aim, but like for your personal well-being. Like it is important to learn how to trust, to like give and take, to make concessions, to I don't know. I this is not like I don't think that romance is offering like a perfect solution, but it definitely challenges the idea that we can like continue to walk through the world without needing anybody ever, which is, I think, a short-term solution to a really large structural problem.
That connects again into not necessarily like the community idea, but some of the other pieces within that, I think connects really well to something that it gets complex when we bring up the idea of gender in a lot of these things, right? Because we want to be so respectful of the idea of non-binary people having their voice in this. I'm sure there are straight cis men who contribute to this and enjoy this as well. And I don't want to feel like I'm excluding them. But just for a moment, knowing that those things are important and knowing that those voices are included and add value to these things. I think one of the big differences when we talk generally about romance versus other genres is the idea of the male gaze versus the female gaze and how that plays into who these characters are and why so often the relationships between characters in romances feel really different to me than they do in books that are more traditionally the male gaze, which is the vast majority of content that we consume.
I have a complicated relationship with the nature of the male gaze and female gaze. I think because like so much of the TikTok discourse about it has like co-opted female gaze to just mean like whatever it is women like, and the point of the construct of the male gaze, as it was like dubbed by Laura Mulvey, I think, is to talk about like the objectification of women in film specifically. And so if the male gaze is the objectification of women in film, then the female gaze, which like may or may not exist, refers to like the way that women presumably see men or like see themselves in film and media. And I think it's kind of amorphous, but also useful for exploring romance, which is often a genre written by women, often features women as the primary audience. Not always, but like in terms of who it's marketed towards and like the subject of most of these romance novels. I guess it's offering space for women to do the looking. I guess I always just go back and forth. Some of this is just like overly academic in my brain.
I love it, though.
So I'm trying to figure out how to say it, because we also talk about stuff like this in school. Like in research, it's become a thing that we've we've kind of talked about. But I appreciate the notion of romance being a space for women to like turn the mirror, like to turn the camera, I guess, and to look at men. But I also think that sometimes romance is not about looking at men, but constructing men, not just observing men with like a gentler, kinder eye than like men view women, but it's also about building the kind of men that straight women are interested in being partnered with. So I think there's merit there. Like I think there's an inherently kind of speculative quality about romance, like in which there's like an imagination of what it could look like to consider women with more complexity and also to build the kind of men that are like not so hard to love as the ones in our real world who are socialized to be like so removed from intimacy. Right? Like there's definitely some element of that, but all of that discourse is definitely really binary and is also really white. So if you look up like female gaze on TikTok, most of the edits are like 5 white dudes who look like stock photos and Dev Patel at the end. First of all, justice for Dev Patel, who is the love of my life. And second of all, I'm sorry, but some of those men do not look like distinguishable to me, you know?
Well, and it's taking the idea of like the male gaze is objectifying women into the female gaze is objectifying men, where that's not the point. It's one of the things that I so often hear women being like, why aren't straight men reading romance? Because then they would understand what women want. And I'm like, the straight men that you're talking about, the cis straight men that you are saying do not understand women are also going to misunderstand romance because many of the men in romance books are described as like super tall and really muscly and like all the like stereotypes of what frankly men think women want. But they also listen to you when you talk. They also support your dreams and ambitions. They also love you with real intentionality. They hear you and they see you for who you are. And that to me is the female gaze. The idea of like somebody loves you and sees you for exactly who you are and the way that you are. And they love the things about you that you love about you. Like that's to me, I think the more interesting conversation is like, what is it about romance and what is it about the relationships and the men and women in a book that is written by a woman or somebody who understands what it is that being a woman is and can be. What is it that those things are in romances that can be misinterpreted as here's a bunch of white men, the female gaze?
I mean, I think I often find like really sort of bioessentialist stuff about gender in romance to be very like female gaze, really. Like when authors talk about inherent masculinity in male main characters or talk about like just enormous foot-long dicks. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that on
Say whatever you want. This is an explicit podcast.
Okay. Great,
We're
amazing.
about to talk about sex, so if the foot-long dicks thing really threw someone off, the rest of this podcast is a big part of romance, so get ready, guys.
Right, exactly. Like, I mean, I think when authors talk about like his maleness, his foot-long dick, those are qualities that I'm like, I'm so uninterested. Like, that actually is like the thing I care least about in a romance. First of all, because I don't think that like gender comes down to genitals. Like it's obviously so much more complicated than that. And second of all, because like penetrative sex is like the very tip of the iceberg. Like it is such a tiny portion of like pleasure and desire. And for most people with vulvas, it's not even a thing that like gets them off. Technically speaking, I find it absurd. And second of all, I think like we need to be more expansive in our definitions of like gender too. So, I mean, I think in terms of like stuff that I find really taxing. I also find like a lot of default whiteness in romance to be annoying, where like characters who are non-white are described by ethnicity and skin color and like white characters are not. Those are things where I'm like, you can talk about female gaze all you want. You've taken a political stance that this is like white feminism and like I can see it plain and clear, right? Like that's one of those things where I'm like, the genre has a ways to go and that's okay too. And there are authors who are doing a really good job and glad to see that.
I am starting to read these romance books, frankly, some of the appeal was the fact that there was going to be sex in it. And it was a way to safely explore that. And that was actually, I referenced earlier the idea of like, I don't even think this was the first of your videos that I saw, but I saw you explaining why sex in romance books is particularly important to women. And one of the things that resonated with me really strongly was the idea is it is a safe place for women to actually explore the fact that they're sexual beings. And I am using the terms men and women here because I think the way that women are socialized, which gender is a social construct. And so particularly when we're talking about that idea of socialization, I think this is something that can be true for trans men and is probably different for trans men. It's probably something that is true for non-binary people, particularly non-binary people who are assigned female at birth. But I think women in general are socialized to believe that men are sexual beings and women are emotional beings. And basically like men's desire is the driver of sexuality. And one of the things that you said in one of your videos was the idea that one of the important things about sex scenes in romance books is that pleasure and particularly a woman's pleasure, which is not true in many non-romance books, is the desired outcome of sex. Like that is an important part of it. That's the reason you're doing it. It really genuinely and sincerely, reading romance books helped me unpack the idea that I was not actually attracted to men in general. I identify as queer, generally not that attracted to men, primarily attracted to women, although we've talked about the idea that gender is a spectrum, all that stuff. So my sexuality lives on a similar spectrum, guys. But that what I really was desiring when I was desiring men was men wanting me. I wanted to be wanted by men. And, but oddly, probably not that oddly to you, but to many people, reading romances where the men were just like really into the women was part of how I was able to discover that that's the part that I wanted. And it was being able to have a safe space where I could be someone with a sexuality, not even being queer, but just like being acknowledging and exploring the fact that I was a person with sexual desires was something I was able to do safely in romance. I hadn't experienced that anywhere else before.
That is, so much of this is, I think, resonating for me, and also like people who I'm sure also like discovered more about their sexualities through romance. I really like this idea of using romance as the litmus test to understand whether you desire men or you desire being desired by them. And I think that's like such a complicated thing because I mean, you mentioned it too, of like sexuality is a spectrum. And I also think it can be temporal, like the way you experience attraction will change over the course of your lifespan. And I took a class on the psychology of sex in the spring for my grad program. And we talked a little bit about like how as young as like early adolescence, like women are instructed, and this is going to use binary terms because that's how this specific lecture was taught, but like that as young as like early adolescence, women are taught that like their sexualities are deficit sites. So like they are operating at a deficit when it comes to desire, and they compensate for what men want. Like there is some sense of like men seek and women exist to be sought.
Woof. That is the most academic way that I've ever had described, like exactly what I've tried to describe to people before.
That process of objectification instead of like perceiving yourself as a sexual subject with a narrative and a purpose and an aim and goals instead of an object in someone else's sexual journey is a dominant theme for like adolescent women. There was this really incredible line in an essay I read for that class where they talked about how desire is conceptualized as male and and desire is monstrous. There's a nature of like a hunt, a pursuit, women as the thing to be conquered and possessed in sexual encounters. And that's where the monstrousness comes in, right? Like they're supposed to regard sex, like women are supposed to regard sex with fear because the end result of pregnancy like always looms, and like so much of sex education for women is just that: avoid pregnancy. And I think a lot about how romance builds a sense of sexual subjectivity for women. Like it creates an entire sexual life, a discourse, a set of desires, and yeah, exactly, a safe mental space to speculate, right? Like to ask questions without the fear of male desire, I guess, as and also the ability to figure out where we conceive of ourselves as. This background track is,
it's so obnoxious and its timing is spectacular. Some of this is getting cut out, but the listeners don't need to know.
They do.
That, like,
it feels like it's on purpose. Like
your neighbors are like, they're listening and they're like, nope, that's too poignant.
I've been thinking about that though, like feminine sexuality as a deficit site and desire as monstrous for a long time. I think it was just phrasing that really worked for me, and it made me realize that like the desire to create, like it is important to create a sense of subjectivity when you think about your sexual life, like to think of yourself as an active person instead of a passive recipient of someone else's desire. And that's, I mean, some romance is really, really good at it. Some is not necessarily. Like there's tons of, and this is something this is the feminist potential, the space where romance is sometimes and could be always, but isn't necessarily, because like not every author is writing essentially a feminist narrative. But like as a genre, I think there is like a larger aim to create subjectivity.
Even within that idea, something that I find really interesting, and I actually saw Katie Roberts had a video about this, but talking about the idea that, and I think consent is also something that is so critical in romances, but I think something that is important and gets lost when we talk about those feminist narratives is the most important consent in a romance is between the reader and the author, because they are the only real people involved in this. So even that idea of like, there are some romances I read knowing that the consent is going to be garbage, knowing that the relationship is going to be some gigantic man dominating a woman with less power than her. That's not something that people want in life, but I read the content warnings and I know what I'm getting into, and I get to go into that with intentionality and control. And I, as a person, have that control, even when the characters may not have that. And having that in and of itself, that idea of the way that consent is explored in romances in general, I think is really, really interesting. And the way that consent lives between author and reader is another interesting layer to it. Because even you saying monstrous there, some of the books that I think you were saying you read, and I know I read, are literal monster romances. And sometimes those are the most gentle, consent-concerned romances I've ever read.
I'm working on a newsletter right now on like monster romance as a prime example of romance as a speculative space for like anti-capitalist work and like better intimacy. And like I love the domesticity of monster romance, like so good. But I also saw that TikTok and loved it. I've been thinking a lot about like coercion and romance, and that is also sort of like a still baking thought. But you're so right of like, we make agreements for ourselves with the text. And I really want to like poke at this thing of like every single act, every single sexual act, every single intimate personal act undertaken by a woman must be feminist. Like, is that true? Like, is every sex scene we need to read in a romance novel, does it need to be anatomically correct, a prime model of consensual sex? Does it need to be like why do we ascribe that to ourselves as readers? And also, is that an honest way to engage with our intimate politics? Like when people are really, really prescriptive about things like that, when they say like, I mean, not from the sense of I won't personally read sex that has non-consent elements in it. I'm sort of like, absolutely, that's your prerogative. But when people say romance writers should never write sex scenes with like ambiguous consent scenes or certain acts or certain things, this is where I want to unpack some of our like sexual puritanism, some of our ideas of what is appropriate reading material. Also our desire to be perfect even in what we read, be perfect feminists, be perfect women seeking liberation. And I don't think that is a valuable line of questioning. You know, we should be able to engage in the speculative space of reading a fictional, maybe ambiguously consensual sex scene between a monster and a human woman. And I don't think that that has any bearing on our desire to have very consensual sex with like human partners.
It's similar to some of the other ideas of what is acceptable. And again, I'm going to use the terms men and women here because that's where the societal like rules live, is within that very binary idea of gender. And then that very binary idea of sexuality, where what is it that men are allowed to want and fantasize about, and then it's their job to control that. And then women are also meant to be in positions of control. The two biggest things I was taught about sex, first of all, the general assumption going in was that men are sexual beings who will desire you, and their desiring you is incredibly important, but it's also very dangerous because your job is to make sure that they don't get you, even though that you have to make them want you. Yeah. And then you have to not let them get you. You could get pregnant. And so how do you make sure that you don't get raped and that you don't get pregnant? That is the only thing you as a woman need to think about. You don't get to think about what would be fun and like what's a fun fantasy and like any of those things. Those are not on the table for women.
No, not at all. One of the other things we learned in that class, the conceptualization of women as gatekeepers, or girls especially as gatekeepers from like men's sexualities. Like it was a thing that men's sexualities and desire was a thing that advanced and progressed, hunted and sought. Women were the people who put up the barriers between what they wanted and what they actually ended up getting. And if you were a bad gatekeeper, then you ended up pregnant and then probably died. I don't know. Like the idea is that like
the classic Mean Girls, you'll get chlamydia and die.
Literally. People are terrified of girlhood, of like early adolescent women, and they're terrified of them having sexual agency of any kind. It's just like such a massive issue. Like, and it's one of those things that like, I don't know if romance alone can correct, but at the very least, it makes this effort to say like, yeah, women are sexual beings. And actually it can start in girlhood. Like YA romance is doing that work, right? Of being like,
yeah,
girls have sexual lives. They like masturbate. They have fantasies. They have desires. Like it is a really scary thing for people to hear, especially when like we still live in a world where like there are father-daughter dances and purity vows given to fathers, and like, you know, someone has ownership over a woman's sexuality until such point that it is transferred in ownership to their presumably male partner, so on and so forth. The baton is passed to everyone except for her. I'm grateful for this like speculative space. I know I keep saying that, but I really think it is.
Can you explain what you mean by speculative space?
I envision romance as a place where people can imagine exactly what they want in their intimate relationships. And I don't think that needs to be a one-to-one. I recently read a monster romance between a Lord of Death and a human woman who was his secretary. It was actually really fun. Love, Laugh, Lick by Kate Pryor. It's a really short novella, but like the point of that book is not for you to like start really envisioning yourself in a loving relationship with a Death Lord who happens to be your boss. Do you hear the beeping? Oh my God. I actually like will never know peace. It just is so outrageous.
It genuinely isn't believable that this is actually happening because of how frequently it happens. You've really cured me of any desire to live in New York.
Yeah, this is actually a light day.
Okay, you were talking about speculative fiction.
I mean, a lot of other genres are really readily considered to be speculative. Sci-fi, for example, is really readily considered to be speculative. It's like a vision of what our future world could look like, and that is both as a warning and as sometimes like an idyllic vision of what the world could be. It can be both hopeful or a warning. Romance is exactly that sometimes it's not offering us a vision of how intimacy exists in our present world. It's offering us a space to envision what intimacy could look like, or give us the tools to bridge the gap between where we are in terms of our like societal relationship to sex and intimacy and where we could be. Because so many things readily solved in romance novels when it comes to intimate relationships, or at the very least, like the obstacles in romantic and intimate relationships are easily traversed. It creates a space for us to envision, like, because none of these things are actually that straightforward in real life. Famously, the happily ever after is not actually that easy to come across in real life. And if it is, it probably becomes a New York Times article and everyone reads it and is sick with longing. It's the point of, we know where we stand culturally, societally, in terms of our relationship to sex, the way men are socialized, the way that like masculinity can be violent. Like we know all of these things to be true. And yet we keep writing stories about a world in which like homophobia doesn't exist, or like where men are tender and gentle and loving. These problems and being able to navigate them and also becoming more sexual beings, that is the speculation. We're thinking about what could be. That space between where we are and what could be, and romance occupying it, makes it a speculative space. And I think some subgenres of romance are better than that than others.
Another concept that I really want to get your thoughts on. So in general, I know that romance, like all media that exists in the world, is still primarily dominated by white and straight and cis culture. There's also something really beautiful in romance. I guess I think that books in general are a lot more accessible for creators to be able to, there's still lots and lots of gatekeepers in publishing, but there's other ways for that to get out. How do you see romance and some of those pieces example of a space where diversity in all its different forms can exist?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think a lot about independent publishing in romance. Like, yes, 100% romance is dominated by like whiteness and straightness and cis identities. That is absolutely 100% true. But also, like, romance is not exclusively dependent on mainstream publishers for people to attract audiences. Like, some of the biggest books on Book Talk in the past year have been indie published through Kindle Unlimited or through other independent publishing avenues, mostly Kindle Unlimited, I think. There are authors making stacks and stacks of money off of their Kindle Unlimited books. Like, they are acquiring audiences and like making a legacy for themselves through indie publishing. It creates a lot of opportunities, especially for authors of color who are neglected or not supported by mainstream publishing. And I don't necessarily think it's like a cure-all, really, because I think there are obligations to write much faster on indie publishing, to always have something coming out like every 6 months to retain your audience. The nature of how these books are publicized on TikTok and off of it means that white authors will still be like privileged. Even of the indie published books that have gone really big in the past year, white authors have dominated most of those. You are seeing people like Rebecca Weatherspoon, Naima Simone, Kennedy Ryan, and Kimberly Lemming. There's so many great, all of the authors I just listed are Black. Like, where a lot of them have made huge audiences in indie publishing. And I think that's a really cool opportunity to investigate. And I think also a lot of queer romance is being published independently as well. And so I think it's a cool place to consider that like romance is not exclusively reliant on massive institutional power. Like you mentioned, romance readers consume at a voracious pace. Traditional publishing alone cannot possibly keep up with the demand and also the specificity of demand. There's a huge audience for kind of funky, weird, kinky, paranormal romance that like is not going to find much institutional support at like Berkeley Pub, but they get thousands of downloads on Kindle Unlimited. It's one of those things where I'm like, because you know that you have a market that is willing to get book after book after book after book, there's space for everybody. There really is. I would hope so, at least, you know? And of course, like, authors of color have come forward about their challenges with marketing and publicizing and things like that. But I think that's something that I see as like a really lovely characteristic of romance. And maybe this is the case in other forms of genre fiction, and I just don't know it because I'm not really seeking out cozy mysteries on Kindle Unlimited. Mostly I'm reading like the most deranged monster romance I can get my hands on. I think that's a really ripe opportunity for more diverse publishing and reading.
That's definitely been what I've seen and heard as well. But I also am not in that cozy mystery. So if you are in that cozy mystery, you can email caresomuchpod@gmail.com and I'll post some stuff about the fact that I was wrong. And here's the great diverse cozy mysteries for folks. We could probably talk about this for 6 or 7 years, and we're going to. So buckle up, everybody. But for people who are listening to this and they're like, hey, I actually would love to read some romance books, we will put some of the books that we've talked about already, some of the authors that we've talked about already in the episode description. As much as I also enjoy some of these other really intense paranormal ones that you're talking about, are there some books, let's say somebody who's listening to this going, I read a lot in high school, and then I stopped reading and I haven't gotten back into it, and I would love a really solid romance. What's like if somebody's like getting into romance for the first time, what's a couple of like first time romance reader books that you would recommend?
So the one I got into romance with was Well Met by Jen DeLuca. Really cute. I really liked it. It's a Ren Fair romance. I think it's Second Chance. like they knew each other before, getting to know each other better now. Both of them are working. It's MF. So the heroine is working temporarily at a Ren fair, falls in love with a guy who is playing a pirate at the Ren fair. It is so cute, really cozy, like a quick read. I thought that was really charming. And I think it's a good contemporary romance to like really wet your feet in, because it's like not super sexually explicit. I think sometimes it can be kind of jarring to throw someone in on the deep end. Of course, most people, you'll escalate pretty quickly once you really get into reading romance. Like the explicitness won't really bother you. If you want to start somewhere, I think that's a good one. I really like recommending the Brown Sisters trilogy, but I think that's really widely recommended. Also contemporary romance. Brown Sisters trilogy is by Talia Hibbert. It begins with Get a Life, Chloe Brown, followed by Danny Brown, and then Eve Brown's book. So each sister gets a book. Really lovely. Talia Hibbert is actually like magic, and every single thing she writes, I would read her grocery list and probably be wildly entertained, if I'm being honest. Another like contemporary go-to, everybody recommends Emily Henry's book, Beach Read, Book Lovers, People We Meet on Vacation. I'm sorry, I'm looking down because all of my books are under my desk.
Perfect.
In what is possibly the most chaotic arrangement of books ever.
And we'll maybe do a more thoughtful recommendation for those intro books where you've had where it's not a question I'm springing on you after making you talk about this for an hour and a half. So we'll include that in the episode description as well as across social. But I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this and are thinking that you're doing a fantastic job of describing all of these things. And they want more of your thoughts all the time of how can they find you on the internet to stalk you in a very safe, distant way.
More than welcome to stalk me. I am really excited. That feels almost like a badge of honor at this point. And, you know, as like the most niche of niche micro internet people, I find that I'm really thrilled to meet other people who are super excited about this thing. But you can find me on TikTok at Baskin Sons, like the beginning of Baskin Robin, and then Sons, S-U-N-S. And then at that same on Twitter. And then I also have a newsletter, which is also baskinsons.substack.com, I think. But the newsletter is called Scratch Paper. But yeah, most of my book stuff happens first on TikTok, like my actual cohesive compiled thoughts. And then Twitter is where I shitpost about whatever I'm reading in that current moment.
Which is wonderful to have access to both. So thank you.
Thank you. I feel really supported on Twitter because it's where I can be like a little more unhinged and less put together. And I really appreciate that for like longer think pieces and personal essays and rambling thoughts I've been sitting on for like decades and haven't known where to put. You can go to my newsletter for that, which is
perfect. Well, and the TikTok has a whole playlist of romance theories, which I binged right before recording this podcast. So if you're like, these quotes are spectacular, this is a really intelligent person who has great things to say, go watch that whole thing. It's like a cool 10-minute video, basically, is what you're watching.
Thank you. I'm very flattered.
Thank you for creating that content. Sincerely. It's so much fun. And it does, I think one of the reasons why it particularly resonates with me is that I am so often looking for that value in the thing. And it is hard, even though we started talking about it with, there is value in and of itself when it brings you joy. That is if this podcast were to have a thesis, that would be the thesis. If it's not hurting anybody and it makes you happy, care about it. The thing that I so enjoy in seeing your stuff is there is also value in romance in a very real, very tangible sense. And you can see a lot of that value and understand a lot of that value in that more academic way by watching Sanja's stuff. So for those of you who are listening to this going, wow, I love caring about things. What are some more things I can care about? Great news. We got a bunch of episodes out that you can listen to. Some of the recent ones were National Coming Out Day. We just did one on adoption and foster care that was really spectacular. One on Native representation in the movie Prey, where we got to talk to Joey Clift, which was really cool. Find us on all sorts of social media to share the things that you care about. It's Care So Much Pod across the internet. And if you're out there and you care about something enough that you could talk about it for hours at a time, and you are finding people who are telling you to tamp down your passion and just shut up about it, and you think that nobody cares, just know that I care. I care so much.